I'm here to just sort of warm up the crowd, actually, but I hope people get plenty of donuts and coffee and that sort of thing, because that's what's really important here. You can tell I teach at a law school, you know, better yet, a state law school. You know, it's always a pleasure for me to come to Washington, partly because Washington is my hometown. I was born just a few blocks from here at the old Sibley Hospital, and you know, lived in East Washington the first months of my life, and then went to high school here and law school here, actually, just also a few blocks, Georgetown Law School, which is not in Georgetown, but it's on Capitol Hill, actually. So one of the things I used to do as a student in the late 70s was go over to the U.S. Supreme Court and listen to oral arguments. And, you know, one of the interesting things about the march is we march past the Capitol, and it really culminates at the site of the U.S. Supreme Court, which is a building that was actually built in the 1930s. Up until then, the U.S. Supreme Court met in the basement of the U.S. Capitol building. But as a child, my mother, who grew up in this area, remembers roller skating in the foundations of the Supreme Court building, which is interesting. But in any case, so it's nice to be back in Washington. I thought I'd really try to make 3 points, and I'm going to start by a kind of commercial. It's for one of my favorite books that came out last year by Ruth Pakaluk called The Appalling Strangeness of the Mercy of God. Ruth is an incredible heroine of the pro-life struggle, really, and this book recounts her story through her letters and talks she gave, the last two of which were talks that she gave to various groups about the issue of abortion, because she was president of Mass Citizens for Life. She died of breast cancer almost 15 years ago, had 7 children, one of whom died of a crib death. But basically the book recounts her odyssey in her own words, from being a pro-choice feminist when she started at Harvard College as a student from New Jersey, and her conversion basically to Christianity and then to Catholicism. But it started really with her conversion to the pro-life cause, and she and her husband Michael were very, you know, intrepid in this battle, and it's an inspiring kind of message that she embodied, really. And those of us who knew her, I think, are kind of in awe of her many virtues and talents. But I just thought I'd quote a little bit from this talk that she gave 15 years ago to high school students. She said, and it relates to the march, really, the March for Life. She said, obviously my job is to get interested young people to go to this march. And how do you sell the idea of getting on a bus at 10 in the evening and riding through the night, getting out before daylight in the dead of winter, spending the entire day outside, going to some of the official buildings and museums, but for the most part, you're outside. You're going to walk for about an hour in a huge march with tens of thousands of people, and then getting back on a bus and riding through the night again, and coming home in the middle of the night doesn't sound that attractive. And this is not a trip for sightseeing. It's not a pleasure trip. I think the only way I could realistically inspire anybody to want to go on this trip is to talk about what the purpose of this march is, and talk about what unites all of the tens of thousands of people who will be there for this march. So I'm going to cover Roe v. Wade, what that decision represents in our country's history and development. And then I want to talk a little about what value systems are competing for your allegiance in this country. I'm not exaggerating. There are 2 diametrically opposed value systems in competition, in conflict, in the United States today. And they're trying to win over you, your hearts and minds. The Holy Father refers to these 2 worldviews as the culture of life and the culture of death. So that's what I want to do today, talk about Roe v. Wade, and then talk about these 2 cultures. And she goes on and gives a fairly devastating analysis of the background and content of Roe versus Wade. And then she says, Now, I want to try to very vividly impress upon you what are the two value systems competing for your allegiance. The first is the pro-life position, which I think is pretty obvious. No, it's not obvious, because of the way that the media always portrays people like me. I am a pro-life activist. I have been doing this for a decade. A lot of my free time goes to trying to teach people and persuade them to be pro-life. Now, what is it that motivates me? The media portrayal of people like me is that we are religious fanatics, just going around trying to make everyone be whatever religion we are, or that we are against equal rights for women, which I always think is a joke, because if I were against equal rights for women, what would I be doing with a job and out in this public sphere, getting involved in politics and public policy debates? And I don't know a single pro-lifer who is motivated because he or she doesn't think women are equal to men, or doesn't believe in equal access to education or professional training, political life, and everything. What motivates us is something that is very simple. We just really do believe that all human beings are equal. All human beings are equal. What could that possibly mean? Because, as you well know, all of us are not equally smart, equally athletic, equally good-looking, equally proficient, equally nice. We're not equal in any of those categories, but we are equal in our essential dignity as human beings. And that means everybody, not just the ones you like, or the ones that look like you or talk your language. It means every single member of the human race has this innate human dignity. It doesn't matter how old they are, healthy, sick, poor. We just don't care. If you are human, then you have this basic equality. So I think that's an extraordinarily eloquent statement of the credo that lies at the heart of the pro-life movement, but probably more importantly at the heart of our country, right? That our country, inscribed on the pediment of the Supreme Court building, are the words "equal justice under law." This basic premise of human equality that is promised us in the 14th Amendment, which talks about no state shall deny any person the equal protection of the laws. So really that's what I think the abortion debate boils down to, and it's the culture of life versus the culture of death. Anyway, so that's the first point I wanted to make, this point that Ruth Pakaluk made, right, in her book. The second point I want to make is something that seems to be a little bit different, but it's related. It has to do with this initiative that's going to be on the ballot in Massachusetts in November to legalize physician-assisted suicide. And I guess there are a couple of states in the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, and the state of Washington. You know, if you're from Washington, D.C., you'll always say the state of Washington. But in any case, in those states, they have legalized physician-assisted suicide for those who are determined to be terminally ill, which means they're given a prognosis of living for another 6 months at most. Of course, those prognoses are notoriously fallible and mistaken. People often live much longer than their sell-by date. You know. But in any case, we have this proposal now in Massachusetts, and everyone who can vote will vote in November, will have a chance to exercise their suffrage on this question. And I just want to point out one feature of this proposal, which has to do with undermining this basic principle that Ruth talked about of human equality. That is, what we're saying is that there's a certain category of human beings who, because of their age, illness, disability, whatever, because they are given 6 months or more to live, or less to live, because of that, basically it's going to be okay for doctors to prescribe poison to them, essentially, to help them leave, make a quick exit. And I think this does, in a very fundamental way, mean that the protections of the law for those people are less than they are for you or me, you know, who are healthy, as long as we are healthy. But someday, I suppose, we're all going to be terminally ill, right? So, I mean, nobody gets out alive. So it's a concern for all of us. I remember a few years back watching this documentary about Holland, and the basic point was Holland is a kind of sad pioneer in this area of physician-assisted suicide. Actually, they go beyond that to active euthanasia, but they were interviewing one of the chief physician proponents of euthanasia in Holland and asking him if he wasn't concerned about, the slippery slope, that is where this was all headed. And his answer was, no, not for another 20 years. I sort of did a calculation, which was, wait a minute now, 20 years from now, I'll be in the eligible, bracket, health bracket, right? So if I'm going to be concerned about this, it's better to be concerned about it now while I'm, more or less able. Okay, so that's my second point, and believe it or not, I actually am coming to a third point, which is related to something that happened last week when the Obama administration announced that it would not exempt religious employers and Catholic organizations like colleges, hospitals, and charities from new regulations that require them to provide insurance coverage for sterilization and contraception, even if they cause abortion. The regulation, which goes into effect August 1st, but which federal officials said would be delayed another year until 2013 for church-related organizations, rides roughshod over the conscientious moral and religious beliefs of many Catholics and others opposed to abortion. The effective date of the controversial regulation is conveniently after the presidential election. The Catholic bishops, led by Archbishop Dolan, who's a cardinal designate, vowed to fight the measure in the court of public opinion, the legislature, and the courts of law. Quote, in effect, the president is saying we have a year to figure out how to violate our consciences. We're unable to live with this, he said. By strange coincidence, just the day before, on last Thursday, the Pope had addressed a group of American bishops in Rome for their periodical ad limina visit. He said, quote, it is imperative that the entire Catholic community in the United States come to realize the grave threats to the Church's public moral witness presented by a radical secularism which finds increasing expression in the political and cultural spheres. Of particular concern are certain attempts being made to limit the most cherished of American freedoms, the freedom of religion. Many of you have pointed out that concerted efforts have been made to deny the right of conscientious objection on the part of Catholic individuals and institutions with regard to cooperation in intrinsically evil practices. Others have spoken to me of a worrying tendency to reduce religious freedom to mere freedom of worship without guarantees of respect for freedom of conscience, unquote. Precisely. Just last week, actually, the U.S. Supreme Court spanked the Obama administration over its overly restrictive understanding of religious freedom, and it was a unanimous decision. The case decided that a Lutheran school teacher fell within a constitutionally mandated religious minister exemption from government anti-discrimination laws. Otherwise, we would have the anomalous situation of government agencies deciding who could teach a particular religion rather than the religion itself. The Supreme Court's decision in the case of Hosanna Tabor Evangelical Lutheran Church versus EEOC was unanimous, which is evidence that the administration was adopting an extreme and marginal understanding, restrictive understanding of religious freedom. While the insurance regulation emanates from the Department of Health and Human Services, headed by the pro-abortion former governor of Kansas, Kathleen Sebelius, the legal position came out of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and was vetted by the Department of Justice. This is all evidence that the buck stops at the president, who is making hash of the first freedom of the First Amendment, freedom of religion. Not only does the First Amendment guarantee that there shall be no official government-sponsored religion called an establishment, but also guarantees the free exercise of religion. This is broad enough to cover religious practice and conscientious objection to involvement in morally questionable practices. HHS Secretary Sebelius explained, quote, "I believe this proposal strikes the appropriate balance between respecting religious freedom and increasing access to important preventive services." Unquote. What balance? Coverage of the morally questionable practices is mandated. Religious employers are required to cooperate in their provision regardless of their consciences. Archbishop Dolan commented, quote, "To force American citizens to choose between violating their consciences and foregoing their health care is literally unconscionable. It is as much an attack on access to health care as on religious freedom." Now the matter will be decided by the courts. The case is called Belmont Abbey College versus Sebelius and is being brought by the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty here in Washington, the same religious freedom law firm that brought the successful challenge to the EEOC's ruling on the religious minister exception. As Cardinal Designate Dolan said, "The Catholic bishops are committed to working with our fellow Americans to reform the law and change this unjust regulation." Unquote. I would just add, the sooner the better. Thanks very much. Good morning.